I want to focus your attention this morning on Acts chapter 10. This is part 5 in a series that I've entitled Religionless. And this morning I want to read from Acts chapter 10. Acts is a book in the Bible, okay? It's in the New Testament, okay? Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. You know those. Acts is the next one. Acts chapter 10. I want to read you a short story beginning in verse 1. Acts chapter 10, verse 1. In Caesarea, there lived a Roman army officer named Cornelius, who was a captain of the Italian regiment. He was a devout, God-fearing man, as was everyone in his household. He gave generously to the poor and prayed regularly to God. One afternoon, about 3 o'clock, he had a vision in which he saw an angel of God coming toward him. "Cornelius," the angel said. Cornelius stared at him in terror. "What is it, sir?" he asked the angel. And the angel replied, "Your prayers and gifts to the poor have been received by God as an offering. Now send some men to Joppa and summon a man named Simon Peter. He is staying with Simon, a tanner who lives near the seashore." As soon as the angel was gone, Cornelius called 2 of his household servants and a devout soldier, one of his personal attendants, and he told them what had happened, and he sent them off to Joppa. The next day, as Cornelius' messengers were nearing the town, Peter went up to the flat roof to pray. It was about noon, and he was hungry. But while a meal was being prepared, he fell into a trance. He saw the sky open, and something like a large sheet was let down by its 4 corners. In the sheet were all sorts of animals, reptiles, and birds. Then a voice said to him, "Get up, Peter, kill and eat them." "No, Lord," Peter declared. "I have never eaten anything that our Jewish laws have declared impure and unclean." But the voice spoke again, "Do not call something unclean if God has made it clean." The same vision was repeated 3 times. Then the sheet was suddenly pulled up to heaven. Peter was very perplexed. I was thinking about the graphic for this series over the last week or so, and I was reminded that it couldn't be more fitting. Religion really does wall us in. It's a system of separation. It builds barriers. It divides the world into secular and sacred. It tells us that all things good, beautiful, and true are found in religious places and heard from religious people. It carves life into compartments. In that sense, it disintegrates things. When I was telling Stacy this morning, as I was thinking about this, that this is sad, but true, that when I want to hear beauty, truth, I rarely find it in religious things. I hear much more truth coming from the lyrics of Roger Waters as he probes the human condition than I do from most preachers. I sense the transcendence of God more in the beats and melodies of Lane 8 than I do in most churches I've ever been in. It's sad to me that because religion has divided things into secular and sacred, it has reduced the places where we can find God, but in reality, that's impossible. Religion tells us what feelings are allowed and which questions are off limits. A video popped up on my social media feed this week of a panel discussion that happened maybe 15 years ago or so. And it was a panel of men that in a previous life I highly admired. I knew some of them. I knew many of them, actually. And it was a question and answer kind of panel. So there was one guy who had received a bunch of questions from people in the audience. It was at a conference. And he would thumb through the questions, ask them, and then the various panel members would answer the question. And the first question was from a woman who had just recently lost her son, a grieving mother. And her question was heartfelt, sincere, filled with angst. And it simply said something like this: I just recently lost my son. I don't know, in fact, I don't think he was a believer in God. And I'm struggling with my anger toward God, and I'm trying to reconcile that with my faith. Can you help me? Honest. And the guy whose conference it was, who was the host of this conference, picked up his microphone, and I was aghast by his answer. And this is a guy that I looked up to, admired for many years. In some ways was a faraway mentor to me. We had spoken at the same conferences on a handful of occasions. And very smart academically, a good theologian in many ways. But I was aghast at his answer. He simply said, grabbed his microphone and said to the woman who had asked the question, through the questioner, repent. That's what you need to do. Repent. Repent in dust and ashes. Crawl across broken glass to repent. It is never right to be angry at God. If I could have reached through the screen and throat punched him, I would have. I'm thinking, zero pastoral sensitivity. Zero empathy. How disconnected do you have to be from actual human beings? How disconnected do you have to be from yourself to answer a grieving mother in that way? A supremely religious answer. Supremely religious. Religion is dangerous in that sense. It paints a false picture of who God is, how God relates to us. It presents God as a hardened person, sort of this, divine schoolmaster just waiting for you to mess up so he can smack your knuckles with a ruler. And it pisses me off because these people are talking about my freaking friend, misrepresenting my best friend and hurting people with that misrepresentation. Religion's dangerous. It tells us what feelings we're allowed to have and what questions are off limits. It tells us which parts of ourselves we need to suppress in order to stay pure in their eyes. It separates us from one another by drawing thick lines between who belongs and who doesn't. We're going to be taking communion later, depending on how fired up I get, maybe much later, okay? But I came from a church tradition that fenced the table. Let me explain what that means. I came from a church tradition, and this is quite popular in a variety of church traditions, where before communion is served, the pastor or the leader stands up and issues this warning. If you are not a believer in God, if you don't know God, or if you don't know that you know God, this meal is not for you. The Bible makes it clear that this meal is for believers in God only. It's not for you. And if you come up and take it and you're not a believer in God, you are heaping judgment on yourself. So for your own sake, stay seated. Don't partake of the elements. Now, they may not say it that harshly. Some do. But they may not say it that harshly, but that's what they do. That's always rubbed me the wrong way. I had a professor in seminary say that what's happening in communion is really no different than what's happening in preaching. In preaching, God is giving himself to people. He's giving himself. He's serving himself to sinners. And in communion, God is serving himself to sinners. In one way, God is serving himself through words. In another way, God is serving himself to sinners through elements like bread and wine. We would never tell somebody, unless you're a believer in God, you can't listen to a sermon. So why would we tell somebody, unless you're a believer in God, you can't partake of the elements? Fencing the table. It's one way that religion screams, who's in, who's out, which only God knows that, by the way, okay? That's behind the curtain kind of stuff. It's none of our business. When we start trying to figure that stuff out, we are operating way above our pay grade, way above our pay grade. I do know that Jesus said, all it takes is a mustard seed of faith. Mustard seed. You don't need to be a super Christian, whatever that means. But religion treats joy like a trap. It treats doubt like failure. It discourages exploration. It shrinks the full, messy, and beautiful range of being human. And in that sense, religion is supremely dehumanizing. Dehumanizing. So, in the end, religion doesn't just divide the sacred from the secular, it divides us from ourselves and one another. I read a quote this past week from Joseph Ratzinger, who went on to become Pope Benedict. I love what he says here. Love it. He said, a theologian who does not love art, poetry, music, and nature is dangerous, since blindness and deafness toward the beautiful are necessarily reflected in that kind of theology. Religion restricts. It restricts the ways we can see God, feel God, hear God, where we can see God, feel God, hear God. But God's whole mission in our lives and in this world is to release, to tear down the walls that separate us from Him and one another. And that's what we see in this story. Peter is very perplexed, extremely perplexed. He had been raised in religious law. He had been raised in the rules and regulations and the holiness codes that separated clean from unclean. He knew who belonged and he knew who didn't belong. He knew exactly how God wanted things done. And then God shows him this vision, a sheet full of animals, everything Peter had been taught to call unclean and to never kill and to never eat. And God says, kill and eat this. It's okay. And Peter freaks out. There's no way. I am not breaking the religious rules. And God essentially says back to him, Peter, that game is over. It is finished. He says, don't call anything unclean that I have called clean. And everything flips. The boundaries that Peter clung to are gone. The rules he had trusted in to keep him righteous and safe are useless. The walls separating clean from unclean are torn down. A massive paradigm shift happens. God is showing him that his grace isn't limited to the approved, the sanitized, or the religiously correct. It comes to a Roman soldier named Cornelius, a non-Jew, an outsider, an unclean person. And Peter is totally discombobulated by this. Peter was very perplexed. That's what grace does, isn't grace perplexing? It upends everything that makes sense to our religiously wired hearts and minds. Grace doesn't operate in the economy of religion. Grace flips the tables in the temple. It saves the wrong people. It forgives the guilty. It welcomes outsiders like Cornelius and me, and throws a party for failures. And most offensive of all, it asks for nothing in return. How offensive is that to our religiously wired, conditional hearts and minds? There's a famous line from a Christian philosopher by the name of Dallas Willard. I've shared this with you before. And this quote has been shot in my direction 10,000 times over the last 20 years or so. This is what Dallas Willard says. Grace is opposed to earning, but not effort. Now, that sounds reasonable. It's the kind of quote that seeks to keep things in check. But every time I hear it, it feels like there's a religious asterisk attached. Like, grace is nice, but keep a leash on it. Or it'll start running wild through the streets, baptizing drunks and prostitutes and tax collectors, forgiving people who didn't even ask for it. And we don't want that. The subtext of that quote is always the same. Yes, grace, but don't go overboard. Yes, grace, but not that much. Yes, grace, but keep it balanced. When it comes to God's grace, we are addicted to disclaimers. We lace the message with warnings. We slap bumper stickers on the gospel and say things like, grace doesn't free you to do what you want, it frees you to do what you ought. But qualifications like this are just our attempt to domesticate something feral, to leash a lion, to put a seatbelt on the wind. Qualifications like this are the attempt to control people from the uncontrollability of grace. That's what it is. Religion fears grace, not because it's weak, but because it's wild. Wild. Religion fears grace because grace doesn't domesticate people. It detonates them. Now, as you can imagine, when you are stubbornly and myopically committed to saying these kinds of things, which I am, you get pushback. You get pushback from religious people. And they'll say something like this, quoting Romans chapter 6, verse 1. Are you saying that we should sin more so that we get more grace? That's the question that the Apostle Paul anticipates in Romans chapter 6. He's just spent 2 chapters, Romans chapter 4 and Romans chapter 5, waxing eloquent on the radicality of God's one-way love, His grace, the substitutionary work of Jesus on our behalf, doing everything for us that we could never do for ourselves, so that we are in with God forever, not because of what we do, but because of what God has done for us. Paul's talked about that. Waxes eloquent, deeply theological in Romans chapter 4 and chapter 5. And then he anticipates this question. I know what you're thinking. I know what your question's going to be. So, are you saying, Paul, in light of everything you just said, are you telling us that we should sin more so that we get more grace? And Paul says, no, that's not what I'm saying. And then he does something interesting. Rather than pull back on the radicality of grace, he pushes it in deeper In essence, what he's saying is, if that's your question, it's not because you get grace too much, it's because you get it too little. It hasn't gripped you yet. So he pushes it in deep. So the people that come at me with, Bible verses and Bible passages, they're barking up the wrong tree in that sense. I have an answer for them. So, isn't this giving out of grace a license to sin? It's a question I'm asked pretty regularly. Not from you guys, thank God, but from the people out there. So let me answer that. Grace is not a license to sin. It's way more than that. Way more than that. It's the only hope we have when we've already sinned 1,000 times too many. So maybe we need fewer disclaimers. Maybe we need fewer caution signs. In a world that is drowning in conditions, religious conditions, social conditions, personal conditions, relational conditions, what people desperately need is a scandalous declaration of what grace is, not another disclaimer about what grace isn't. Grace breaks the machine, the religious machine. It disrupts the religious game. It declares that all the love, all the belonging, all the approval, all the peace, all the security that you're hustling for, you already have it with God right now. No additions, no upgrades needed, no fine print. Grace lets you exhale. It allows you to be human because God isn't keeping score. That score was settled 2,000 years ago on an old rugged cross on top of a garbage heap. Grace breaks through all the walls we build, all the categories we cling to, all the holiness codes we think define us. And it doesn't come wrapped in rules. It comes wild, untamed, and free. And it doesn't just change the way you see yourself, it changes the way you see others also. Religion builds walls. Grace builds bridges. For me, personal testimony here, not that this will surprise any of you. Music has always been the clearest place where God sneaks up on me. Always. Sometimes it happens by reading things. Most of the time it happens by hearing things. I'm a thinker. My brain's wired that way. Love philosophy, history, psychology, theology. Studied that stuff in both college and graduate school. But I don't think my way toward God. More often than not, I feel his approach. I feel it. I feel it in melodies and moods. In sudden moments when a song hits a nerve I didn't know was exposed. Music has carried me when words failed. It still does. When prayer felt impossible, when all I could do was listen. For me, music isn't background noise. It is a carrying mercy. It cracks me open. It wakes me up. It softens what life has hardened. And that softness is grace in practice. The freedom I feel in music is the freedom of grace. The freedom to be free. The freedom to be expressive. The freedom to be myself. The freedom to be human. The freedom to be fully alive. The freedom to feel what I feel without suppressing it. It is the permission to bleed, to laugh, to be sarcastic, to break down. So, while religion shuts things off, grace turns things on. You'll know, inside you'll know when you encounter religion as opposed to grace. You'll know. When you encounter religion, you feel restricted, a little less free. Maybe you feel like you have to keep your mask on in the presence of religion. But grace turns things on. It's like LSD from God, okay? Religion lulls us to sleep. Grace wakes us up. Religion sedates, but grace stimulates. It makes the world feel newly alive because you feel newly alive. You start seeing things differently, hearing things differently, feeling things differently. You start spotting beauty in broken places and value in relationships that you used to overlook. You slow down, not just on the outside, but on the inside, and you begin enjoying conversations maybe that you once tried to escape. You listen more. You look at people, not through them. Your eyes change. When I was a real studly up-and-comer, professionally speaking, in my own eyes, I would be in important rooms with what I thought were important people. And regardless of who I was talking to, regardless of how engaged I may have seemed to the person I was talking to, I was always looking through them to see if there was a more important person. Got to network, build the brand, solidify the platform. When God nuked the platform in my life, people, not platforms, became important to me. And it's not like I tried. It's not like I read a book on how to look at people rather than through them. There may be a book out there like that. I don't know of it. It's just what happens when you're at rock bottom, the things you learn. When you're on the bathroom floor, the things that start to matter, everything gets reprioritized. Everything. Speaking of which, my friend Byron sent me a recent interview in which Anderson Cooper spoke with musician and writer Nick Cave. Short excerpt. Blew me away. Blew me away. I read it to Stacy. I had to start crying. And when I feel I write, it's how I get what's in me outside. And sometimes I write just for me, and sometimes I write for others. Oftentimes it's for both. But in this interview, and Nick Cave, for those of you who don't know, Jenna saw him this summer in Zurich. But Nick Cave is sort of known for his dark, poetic songs and his brutally honest reflections on life. And in this interview, he spoke about losing his 15-year-old son, Arthur. He's lost 2 sons, but he was estranged from one. Arthur, his 15-year-old son, died in 2015. And I want to read what I wrote after listening to that clip. He said Arthur's death didn't simply wound him, it widened him. The agonizing grief rearranged the inner furniture of his life, creating a larger capacity for love, compassion, and connection. He said, I don't know where I would be if my son hadn't died. Grief turns you into a person. Before, I was incomplete. He reflected on how over time we don't get over our losses, we absorb them. We become different kinds of people, more human, more tender, more awake to the fragile beauty of the world and the people in it. Grief humbled him. It toppled the pedestal he once put his own gifts on and brought him back to what matters most, being a father, a husband, a friend, a person among people. And in that undoing, a larger world opened inside of him. I feel that. All of it. In the deep places. Maybe that's the strange, sacred transcendence of loss. It tears through the small, protected rooms we once lived in and leaves behind a larger interior world, one marked by deeper seeing, deeper feeling, and deeper connection to the sorrows and joys of other people. Grief, or rock bottom, or desperation, or loss takes much from us, but it also gives us an expanded heart. A heart that carries a kind of freedom we could never have imagined before, a freedom born not from having less to lose, but from becoming more fully alive. Religion doesn't allow that. Grace builds mansions for that stuff. When Jesus says, so if the Son sets you free, you will be free indeed, he meant it. Not kind of free, not simply free to do what you ought, which is then defined 10 different ways by 10 different people. Not someday free, free here, free now, free indeed. Free from judgment and condemnation, free from the crushing need to measure up and get it right, free from the exhausting game of image management, free to fall apart without fear, free to not have the answers, free to laugh, to weep, to doubt, to dance, free to relax and breathe and listen and engage, free to fail, free to take risks, free to be weak, free to be real, free to be honest, free to live unedited, free to live without a mask. Mask polishing is such an exhausting way to live. You're not a fixer-upper, by the way. You're not slowly becoming someone God will one day love. You are loved now, as you are, fully, finally. Not because of what you've done, but because of what he has done for you. When it comes to grace, there is no fine print. There are no holy footnotes. The work is done. The case is closed. Alan Watts put it in a way that I wish I would have put it. If you're a reader like me, you often read things that enlighten you and piss you off at the same time because you wish you would have said it, you know? This is one of those passages that I wish I would have said. He said this, he sums it up this way: the meaning of life is just to be alive. It's so plain and obvious and simple, he says. And yet everybody rushes around in a great panic as if it were necessary to achieve something. So, you're free. Be human. Feel it all. Listen. See. Enjoy the gift.